From The Times and The Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Luke Jones. For 6 weeks in Manhattan, an historic and dramatic trial has been underway, all behind closed doors.
On the really big days, I would arrive at 5 a.m. and I would not be anywhere near the front of the queue.
Will Pavia, our man in New York, has been there every day, watching the first former US president in the criminal dock.
I've never been in prison, and I don't want to be overly dramatic about this, but you do feel like you are policed the entire time. The other day, this big court officer came into court. The court had just broke for 15 minutes, and he said, "Okay, let's make it more like 10 minutes, less jarring on the phone, less sandwich, more going to the bathroom, okay? And then get back in here." It's a rather strange experience, but very interesting.
The prosecution and defence have now rested their cases. Next week, we've closing arguments and maybe a verdict. Did Donald Trump commit fraud with the hush money he paid to the porn star Stormy Daniels? Or is he the victim of political persecution? Which side told it best? The Story today, felony or witch hunt? Inside Trump's trial. You've been sitting through this Trump trial. How do you get in? What is a day like for you when you're going to this trial? Where do you start?
So getting in, it's a bit like boarding an aeroplane in that there is a very rigorous class system. Okay. So there are 58 seats in the courtroom, and the first 54 of those are allocated to American newspapers and television channels. And then the final 4 are divided up among members of the foreign press like me, and there's sort of a trading system amongst us. In any case, if you're in that listed sort of 58 people for those seats, you turn up between 7 and 7:45 and you let in, and it's a very pleasant experience. If you are not, there are three queues across the road, and there's an overflow room which has 114 seats in it. And there's one queue for sort of seasoned court reporters who have a special court pass, and then there's another line for the media, and there's another line for the public. Now, people who want to get in, obviously from the public, they get in last. So they start queuing up the day before quite often.
What, and stay there overnight?
Yeah, like from midday the day before, you'll see people lining up in the queues, and they'll have tents, and they'll have like sort of these seats with them. And there are also these line guys who obviously charge by the hour to hold a space in the line. And then at some point the police arrive, and you go through 2 sort of security checks, one on the ground floor, one on the 15th floor. And the 15th floor, when the president is there, is sort of locked down. So whenever he moves, wherever you are, you have to stay there. So quite often you'll be in the lavatory and a police officer will shout in the door, "We're clearing the corridor." So you've either got to stay where you are, you've got to run for it.
And on the days, Will, that you have a first class ticket, you get to turn left as you go into the courtroom and actually get to sit in the room where Trump is. Where are you and what can you see from your vantage point?
So it's a fairly big courtroom, and you're in the public gallery, so these sort of pews, these wooden pews. So you will be seated in there quite early, usually by about 8 o'clock or 8:30, and the court doesn't start till 9:30. So you get to see everybody come in. You get to see the prosecutors come in through a side door, and then you'll see Donald Trump coming in with his lawyers, and he'll sort of walk down the aisle, and sometimes he'll know somebody in the audience, and he'll sort of wave and smile at them. More recently, he's been coming in with these huge entourages of congressmen and sort of, former actors. There was a former president of the New York chapter of the Hells Angels who's been coming a couple of times. He's a man with a sort of very shiny, sort of enormous styled black hair. It looks like something from the 50s. It's extraordinary. And so he'll be in the entourage. And sometimes they all wear the same red tie, and they all sort of walk after him, and they sit in the front 2 rows.
And they're just there for moral support?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay, let me make just a few observations here, and then I'll kick it over to Senator Tuberville, and we can go down.
And actually, part of the reason that Trump's been inviting members of Congress is he's under this gag order which stops him from talking about witnesses or the jurors. And obviously these members of Congress are not under the gag order, so they will come out before court or at lunchtime and they'll attack the witnesses. They'll attack Michael Cohen and say that he's a liar.
In there. First of all, Michael Cohen is the prosecution's star witness. This guy is a convicted felon who admitted in his testimony that he secretly recorded his former employer, that he only did it once, allegedly, and that this was supposed to help Donald Trump. Does any reasonable, sensible person believe anything that Michael Cohen says? I don't think that they should, and I actually think that his testimony is going to hurt with any reasonable juror.
Oh, interesting, because previously Trump had been doing that and got ticked off. So this is a way of subletting.
Yes. There's been claims, and I haven't seen this myself, but there's been claims that he's actually he's editing what they're going to say, and he's looking at it and then handing it back to them. I don't know that, but that's been reported. But anyway, they come out, and yes, it's a run around the gag order.
And when Trump is sitting there, because he has been there every day, because he's had to be, what does he look like when people have been giving evidence?
So he's sitting at the defence table. So he's got a lawyer on his right who's going to be leading whatever the cross-examination is, and then he's got two lawyers to his left. We can see the back of his head from the courtroom, but there are also these screens which send a feed to the overflow room, and they have a camera on him from the front, and they also have a camera on the prosecution table and one on the judge and one on the witness. So we've all started bringing binoculars. So you can look at these screens and you get a pretty good view of Trump's face and what he's doing. He has spent a lot of this trial sort of sitting back in his chair with his eyes closed. It does look a lot of the time as if he's asleep.
And Trump has, of course, been quiet in the courtroom. He's not taken the stand. You said he's been ticked off by the judge for going a bit too far with what he said outside of the court, so as, sublet some of it to some of the hangers-on who he's had come along with him, congressmen and the like. But he has still been saying some things outside the courthouse as he arrives and as he leaves. What's the general flavour of it?
But I've been here all day on a trial that really is a very unfair trial. These are all stories. This is over the last few days from legal experts. This is Wall Street Journal editorial. But all of these are stories from legal experts saying how this is not a case.
Quite often he'll read out printouts of newspaper articles that are sympathetic to him.
Read them out?
Yeah.
As in there with a sort of bit of A4?
Yeah.
But take a look at all of these are stories. You see them here. Gregg's indictment even falls as an indictment. All of them. Gregg crosses the Rubicon, indicting Trump on that sense. The whopping outrage in Trump's indictment. It's a whopping outrage and it is an outrage. Everybody's outraged.
Well, that's the circus. Let's get into the meat of actually what's being heard. Just briefly, what is the prosecution's case and what is the defence's case?
So, I'll try to be brief. The prosecution case is Trump announces his run for presidency in 2015. He meets with the publisher of the National Enquirer, David Pecker, at Trump Tower, and Pecker says he'll do everything he can for Trump's presidency. He'll try and kill negative stories or stop them appearing, and he'll try and sort of boost positive stories for Trump. Now, a year later, he does this by apparently buying up the story of a lady called Karen McDougal, a former Playboy playmate, who said that she'd had an affair with Trump in 2006. Pecker says that he paid $150,000 for that, and he was sort of under the understanding that he'd been reimbursed, but he wasn't. In any case, in October of 2016, a hot mic tape emerges of President Trump talking about grabbing women by the genitals, and it's published by the Washington Post, and prosecutors say this threw the campaign into chaos. And when a story came out almost the following day, when they learnt that another woman named Stormy Daniels, a porn star, was saying that she had an affair with Trump and wanted to sell her story, they say that Michael Cohen eventually ended up paying her $130,000 to keep quiet just before the election, and that Trump then reimbursed Cohen in 2017 through a series of checks that were made to look like payments for legal services, but were actually a reimbursement. So he's charged with falsifying business records to conceal this payment and to conceal another crime, essentially.
And the defence?
The defence is that Michael Cohen is a liar and that he can't be trusted, and that there's no crime here, there's nothing illegal with trying to influence an election. Cohen may have done this, he may have made this payment sort of on his own. He was a criminal, Trump didn't know about this, and when Cohen was charged with campaign finance violations in relation to the $130,000, he tried to blame it all on Trump. So this is what's going on here.
And also, I guess it should be said that the defence don't necessarily have to convince the jury of an alternative narrative. They just have to make them not believe the prosecution case, isn't that right?
Exactly. They just have to raise enough reasonable doubt that this is as the prosecution tell it.
Let's get into the prosecution case then, because they started first and they had their witnesses on the stand first. You mentioned David Pecker there, formerly of the National Enquirer. He took the stand first, didn't he?
That's right. He was on the stand for several days, essentially sort of saying the story that I've just sort of laid out, which was that he had a deal with Donald Trump that was struck at Trump Tower, that he would sort of help kill negative stories either by buying them up or by sort of, making sure they didn't see the light of day. So you had him, you had Keith Davidson, who was Stormy Daniels' lawyer. You had Hope Hicks, who was Trump's longtime sort of spokesperson and communications director in the White House. And you had Jeff McConney, who was the former controller of the Trump Organization.
One of the star and most interesting turns was, of course, Stormy Daniels, and Jane Mulcairns, the fabulous Jane Mulcairns, gave us a good briefing on her just before she took the stand. What happened when she did? The woman who is really at, a part of the centre of this.
I mean, that was a really extraordinary day in court. She started a little bit nervously, and prosecutors sort of took her through her life story. I think sort of making the case this is a person who's clever, who's bright. And she also talked in really sort of quite graphic and intimate detail of her encounter with Trump. She described the tiles in the hotel suite. She described the sort of table arrangements, the flowers. Trump appears in the suite sort of next to the flowers, and he's wearing his pajamas. And she says, are you Hugh Hefner? Go and get changed. And so he goes and gets changed. And they sit down, and he sort of says, look, we'll talk first, and then maybe we can go and get something to eat. And she described, I don't know how much detail you want here, but she described in great detail this conversation with Trump where, he talked to her about the porn industry, and she was quite impressed by the fact that he asked all these quite businessy questions. Do you have a union? How often do you get tested? But the other funny thing is that she said that he kept talking about himself, because at some point he's asking her about cover magazines, covers that she's had on magazines. And then he says, well, I've had covers, look at this. And at some point she gets quite cross with him for just only talking about himself and cutting her off. And she says, the only thing I'm going to do with that magazine is someone needs to spank you with it. And so then he sort of said, all right. And he sort of hands it to her and sort of leans over, and she does. She gives him a couple of swats, she said. Anyway, at this point, the defense is sort of like, Judge, this is not relevant. But in any case, at some point, she goes to the bathroom, she tries to call her friend, and she says that when she comes out again, he is sort of spread on the bed. And she actually sort of almost did an impression of him. She kind of threw her head back in the witness stand, put her head on her hand, and pretended to be sort of almost like she was lying on a beach or something. But in any case, she said it happened. And then she remembers her hands shaking as she's trying to put on her shoes. And he's kind of saying, oh, that was great. That was fun. Let's do it again. And she kind of just leaves the hotel.
And of course, Trump, for his part, denies all of this. And as you suggested, his defence team, as she was laying all this out, was spitting feathers and actually kicked up a fuss after she finished her testimony that they weren't happy about it at all.
Yes, they felt that it was highly prejudicial, and it's not really anything to do with the falsifying of business records. So they sort of made that point. The judge went back and read the openings, the transcripts of the openings, and what he said was, actually, you said in the opening that Stormy Daniels' story was false, and that immediately opened the door for the prosecutors to establish that she's credible, that her story is credible. And so it's really your fault. The judge also said, actually, and this was certainly a day when you did not want to be a Trump lawyer, he said, you should have objected more, and I can't understand why you didn't. And I actually had to move in and cut off some of the testimony. But he said, I wish there'd been an objection. I wished, for instance, that we hadn't heard that Trump didn't wear a condom. He said that would have been better unsaid, but you should have objected and you didn't.
And what did you make of her appearance? Do you think it was helpful for the prosecution, or in, as you say, being so graphic and the rest, and maybe sidebar to the actual niche issue of the criminal trial, helpful maybe for the defence?
I think there was two parts to it. The first, her on direct testimony, she was very compelling, but perhaps there was too much detail, who knows. The really interesting part from her was when she was under cross-examination, when she was incredibly composed. She was just very, very good at countering Trump's lawyer, Susan Neckles. Susan Neckles sort of tried to say, you are a porn star and you make up stories about people having sex, don't you? And she sort of said, no, actually in pornography, the sex really happens. It's true. Otherwise, it would just be a B movie. So she was very good under fire, and I think probably was quite convincing to the jury. And of course, she was one of the big witnesses, but there was another huge witness around which the whole case spins, who was still to come.
Will, you've been taking us through Donald Trump's criminal trial, his historic criminal trial, now that it has rested, and now we await closing statements. You're taking us through what Stormy Daniels was saying, but as you hinted, there was arguably a more pivotal witness to take the stand, Michael Cohen. Before we get into what he said, just remind us who he is, because he's had quite a journey with Trump, hasn't he?
So Michael Cohen is from Long Island. He's the son of a Holocaust survivor who became a surgeon and a nurse. He became a lawyer. He didn't go to a terribly good law school. He came out and started working for an injury lawyer who later got into legal trouble himself. He worked as a lawyer in a taxi garage where he also started buying up taxi medallions for New York City yellow cabs. And he also started buying property, and he was buying a lot of properties in Trump properties, so a lot of flats in old condos in Trump properties. And that's how he encountered Donald Trump. He sorted out a problem or helped Trump sort out some issues he was having with the sort of management board of one of his towers. And Trump was very grateful and essentially brought him in as a lawyer and fixer. He was someone who had to clear up Trump's troubles. So he would threaten people, he would bully journalists, he would shout at them down the phone if there was a story that Trump didn't like. But Cohen's version of this was that he was having a fantastic time. It was tremendously exciting. There was a few sort of sideways comments from other witnesses about what he did. Jeff McConney in particular, someone said, so he was a lawyer, and he said, well, he said he was. So there's some debate amongst other Trump employees about exactly what he was doing, but he was Trump's guy. He reported directly to him, and his job was to sort of clear up messes. That's what he said he did.
And how important was Michael Cohen's testimony to this case for the prosecution?
So he's the key witness because the prosecution have lots and lots of documentary evidence. They have the bank statement showing that Cohen paid $130,000 to Stormy Daniels' lawyer. Cohen is the one who can say, Trump told me to do this. Trump told me to make this payment to Stormy Daniels, and he was also involved in the cover-up. And without Cohen, you don't really have any direct evidence of that. So that's why he's so important.
So important, but such a tricky witness for the prosecution. I mean, he's not the star witness they would have wanted, really.
Absolutely not. So what happened with Michael Cohen is it becomes public in 2018 that he's made this payment to Stormy Daniels. And initially what he says is, I just did this out of my own funds. It was nothing to do with Trump, and I just did it myself. And no one really believes that. And he is eventually charged with campaign finance violations. You know, that he faces a big investigation, and they also decide that he's guilty of tax violations as well. And they also decide that he's lied to Congress while talking about Trump's sort of connections with Russia, a Trump Tower project. So he pleads guilty and goes to prison. And when he pleads guilty, he says, everything I did at the direction of President Trump. And when he comes out again, he sort of vows that he was going to hold Trump accountable, and he starts a podcast, and he's also involved in another podcast on which he's regularly sort of attacking his old boss and saying he'd like to see him caged like an animal, he'd like to see him jailed. And he keeps podcasting right up to the trial, and he's also going on TikTok.
Michael Cohen here with another Michael Cohen Reacts. Well, it's been a while because, for a week I've been suspended on TikTok, but I'm back, and I will be on for my 10 o'clock p.m. show tonight and every night until, of course, TikTok suspends me again. But who cares? Judge Merchan just ruled that the trial will start on April 15th.
So you've got this record of lying under oath. Now, the prosecutors did their best to say, well, you were lying to protect President Trump, weren't you? And actually, he was cross-examined about this in great length. And at some point, he said, well, the statement that made me guilty of lying to Congress was actually drafted, in the White House as part of a joint cooperation agreement with Trump's lawyer. And so I was doing this in his interest because I was still on the Trump team. At some point, he said he was knee-deep in the Trump cult. But so, he sort of made the case, well, I lied then because I was defending Trump. The other thing that the defense did, which was very successful, was they surprised him on the stand with, he talked to the prosecutors about all these phone calls he'd had with Trump in October of 2016 when he was, deciding whether to make this payment. And he said one of them was on the 24th of October in the evening, and he called Keith Schiller, Trump's bodyguard, and Keith Schiller put Trump on the phone, and he said, look, it's all in order, it's all progressing. Now, the defense showed him a series of text messages before that phone call where he's been getting these harassing text messages and calls from somebody who appears to be a teenager, and he sort of says, look, I'm going to have to talk to Secret Service about this. You haven't blocked your number. I know who you are. And 10 minutes before he called Keith Schiller said, call me. So he called Keith Schiller, and so the defence said, you were talking about those harassing text messages. You weren't talking about Stormy Daniels. When you said you were, that was a lie. It was quite a powerful, almost sort of a few good men type moment. He's really sort of pounding the podium, and
you can't handle the truth.
He's like, yeah. Well, he says at some point, Cohen said something like, I believe it was about, I also talked about that. And he said, I don't want to know what you believe. I want the truth. It was very strong from Trump's lead lawyer. And Cohen sort of said, well, this has refreshed my recollection. I probably talked about both things. But that was probably one of the biggest hits that the defence got in.
That all sounds so messy. How do you think it went? Which side do you think Cohen was most useful for at the end of all of that?
So I think the one thing I would say for Cohen is that he was incredibly calm and restrained on the stand. At some point, the defence played a series of clips from his podcast. And if you ever listen to his podcast, there's a bit at the beginning where he's reading out the headlines where he sounds like he's going to explode. I mean, he's just incredibly bombastic. And so I think the reason they played this was they wanted the jury to have him saying, revenge is a dish best served cold, and sort of implying that he wanted to see Trump in jail. But the other effect, I think, might have been that the jury were like, oh, wow, this is the same guy. That we're hearing here is very different to the guy on the stand. However, I think because he kept his cool, and because he sort of very calmly testified to all of these things, he admitted where he'd lied in the past, he sort of gave a reason for it, and quite often he sort of was able to make the case that he was doing it for the sake of President Trump. I think the prosecution will be relatively happy with what they have from him. And he's given them as much as he could, and he has tied Trump into everything, and it's just whether or not the jury will believe him.
And that, for the most part, was the prosecution's side of things, all of their witnesses. It was then the defence's turn to call their witnesses. And, well, tell us about the witness that they brought on Monday, just before the case rested on Tuesday ahead of closing statements.
Yes, so the second witness, I just say the first witness was a paralegal who had made a chart of all Michael Cohen's phone calls with a lawyer called Robert Costello. The defense then called Costello. And Costello, initially is sort of, I guess, gives them some of what they want in that he says that when he met Cohen in a sort of hotel conference room in Manhattan, Cohen is pacing around. He's very manic. He thinks he's going to kill himself. He's very agitated. I mean, his life's just been turned upside down. And he's saying, I have nothing on Trump. So the defense would be, quite happy to have that testimony. But Costello, he was a very tricky witness in that although he's a lawyer, a long-time lawyer, and he was once a federal prosecutor, he seemed to sort of be unaware of basic sort of court decorum. So there are lots of objections to what he's saying because the judge has issued some rulings about what he can and can't say. And sometimes he carries on talking and the judge will say the objection is sustained and the answer is stricken. And at some point there's an objection and he goes, geez. When he says geez, the judge says, I'm sorry, and then says a bit louder, I'm sorry. And he says, strike it. And then the judge says, sorry, we're just going to have to ask the jury to leave for a moment. So the jury will get out. And he starts to admonish Costello and he says, you don't say geez and you don't say strike it. I'm the only one who can strike testimony. You're a witness. You need to know decorum. And all the while, Costello is sort of staring at him. And Costello's in the witness box. It's quite close to the judge. It's just a little bit lower than where the judge is sitting. And he's just about to call the jury back in. And then he says, are you staring me down right now? And then the judge says, clear the courtroom. I was in court that day and the court officers are trying to get all of us out.
And you're like, absolutely not, I'm seeing this.
Well, some of the journalists are standing up and protesting. There's a media lawyer there who represents some of the newspapers who's sort of saying the media have a right to see this. But the court officers, once they've been set in motion, it's like a train, so they get everybody out apart from the guests of Trump and Trump's lawyers. And we all go into the corridor. It's a very strange situation. A few minutes later, the judge brings us all back in. And there's a slightly chastened-looking Mr. Costello still on the stand. He came off, actually, I heard someone talking about this recently, saying that it was amazing that he was somehow less reliable on the stand than Cohen. He was the one who had this blow up. And he was the one who was brought in to discredit Cohen.
Mm. And that was the defence.
Yes.
So they've rested now. So that's not it. Why did the defence rest so quickly? Why did they not call more people? Why did they not call Trump to sit on the stand and account for himself?
Well, Trump is perhaps the only useful witness to them. It's quite hard, in fairness to the defence, if your case is that there was no crime and there's nothing to see here. It's quite hard to call anyone who'd seen it.
It's quite hard to prove a negative.
Yeah, and the jury gets some quite heavy instructions on this, and even when they're being selected, they say, the defence may not put on a case, and you mustn't hold that against Trump. And, they want to assure the judge they wouldn't hold it against him. So why they didn't call Trump, Trump in recent cases has appeared really eager to testify, and it seems as if his lawyers have talked him out of it. He's always maintained that he did not sleep with Stormy Daniels. The prosecution would almost certainly go into huge detail, bringing up all these other kind of corroborating witnesses on those things. And whether he could control himself on the stand, I think, would have been a question as well. And it could have led to all kinds of other trouble, I think, for his case.
So Tuesday's when we'll have closing statements, so each side will summarise, I guess, the points they've tried to get across. How soon after that could we get a verdict? Could it also be Tuesday that the jury come back?
I would suspect that closings will take all of Tuesday, and then the judge will have to instruct the jury. It's really important because in a case like this where there's still an argument about what the crime is that Trump was trying to conceal by making these payments. And the prosecutors have sort of offered a couple of options to the crime that he was trying to conceal, but they don't actually have to prove that he committed that crime. So they're sort of saying, well, it was an attempt broadly to sort of defraud the electorate, and it could be a campaign finance thing, an excessive campaign contribution. But they haven't specified, and so I think that may detain the jury a while, sort of deciding what the crime was that Trump was trying to conceal and whether he was trying to conceal it. So all of that stuff on intent, I think, will take a while. They either get the case Tuesday evening or Wednesday morning. I would think it would take them a couple of days, but who knows? It's the first criminal trial of a former president. I would think that they will take their time.
Who are your chips on, Will?
Oh, gosh, I don't know.
You can't split. We want your whole pile on either side.
Well, I think the prosecutors have had a better time of it. They often do. In a sense, these things are sort of, they have more resources and it's their story they're telling. So I think they'll be very happy with how the case came in, broadly speaking. Although I do still wonder about all this business about this being a fairly new, this legal theory that the whole thing's resting on and the intent. And of course, you only need one juror who's not going along with it to cause a mistrial. So it's really, really hard to pick at the moment. I sort of think the prosecutors have made their case, but yes, I'd like to stay on the fence as much as I possibly can.
I will allow it on this occasion. Will, thank you. Enjoy court on Tuesday.
Thanks, Luke.
Will Pavia, Times New York correspondent, back off to join that courthouse queue, no doubt. If you want more from the Trump trial, Will has every twist and turn in his court diaries and dispatches. You will find them at thetimes.co.uk if and only if you have a subscription. We had a sensational chat with the ever-interesting Jane Mulkerrins the other day about Stormy Daniels, someone she has interviewed quite a lot. Do give that a listen if you haven't already. We'll put a link to that in the description. This episode was produced by Taryn Siegel with production support from Edith Rousselot. The executive producer was Kate Ford and sound design was by Hannah Varrell. Our theme tune was composed by Mao Lassetto. Give us a big fat 5 stars on whatever app you're listening to us on and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.